The winter air bit at her skin as she pulled the oversized coat tighter around her tiny frame. It wasn't really a coat, not anymore, just a patchwork of frayed fabric and holes that did little against the cold sweeping down the streets of downtown Chicago. Her name was Lily, though nobody in the crowd of passers-by knew that. To them, she was just another face among the forgotten, one of the countless invisible souls who huddled in doorways or wandered sidewalks with tired eyes. But tonight, Lily wasn't content with being invisible. Clutched against her chest was her single treasure, a battered violin case that had traveled with her through every storm. It was scratched and worn, but when she looked at it, she still saw memories of her father teaching her to play under the glow of a flickering lamp. That violin was the last piece of her old world that had survived. She stopped outside a restaurant that glowed with warmth and laughter. The windows were alive with golden light, and inside, diners clinked glasses, their voices rich with comfort and ease. The scent of roasted garlic, baked bread, and sizzling steak drifted out whenever the door swung open, and Lily's stomach twisted with a deep, aching hunger. She hadn't eaten since yesterday morning, and even that meal had been nothing more than stale bread a stranger had left behind on a park bench. She stood there, shifting her weight nervously, her breath visible in the frosty night. Finally, she stepped forward, voice trembling as she whispered toward the group waiting outside the door. Can I play for food?" At first, no one paid her any mind. Then someone chuckled, the sound sharp and dismissive. A tall man in a tailored suit raised an eyebrow, smirking as he nudged his companion. "Play for food? What is this, some kind of street performance audition?" His friends laughed, the sound cruel in its ease. Another woman, draped in a fur-lined coat, shook her head. "Sweetheart, you'd make more money begging than pretending to be a musician," she said, her tone dripping with mockery. Heat rose to Lily's cheeks. Every instinct told her to shrink back into the shadows, to curl into herself and disappear as she had so many times before. But something stronger pushed against the fear, the memory of her father's voice telling her that music wasn't just sound, it was a way to speak when words failed. And right now, words had failed her. Hunger had failed her. She only had music left. Her fingers fumbled as she opened the case. The violin inside was chipped, its varnish dulled by years of wear, but to Lily it was still beautiful. She lifted it carefully, cradling it as though it might break under the weight of the world's scorn. As she positioned it beneath her chin, a few more people had gathered, curiosity tugging at their expressions. Some crossed their arms, waiting for the inevitable embarrassment, already ready to laugh again. She drew the bow across the strings, the first note shaky, uneven. Someone snickered, but then came the next note, steadier, and then another, until the melody began to flow. It wasn't a cheerful tune. No, it was something raw and aching, a song she had written in her heart through nights of loneliness and hunger. The sound swelled in the cold night air, weaving between the hum of traffic and chatter. Slowly, laughter fell silent. The song told a story no one expected. Each note was heavy with sorrow yet lifted by hope, like a candle flickering in the darkness refusing to go out. Her small body swayed gently with the rhythm, her eyes closed as if she were somewhere far away. A child in the crowd tugged on her mother's sleeve and whispered, "She sounds like the people in the movies, Mama." The mother's eyes softened, tears welling despite herself. The man who had mocked her first stood frozen, his smirk gone, his jaw tight as though the music had reached into some part of him he didn't want exposed. A young woman stepped closer, her breath catching as the melody seemed to unravel her own hidden grief. And one by one, people who had been ready to dismiss Lily found themselves stilled, their hearts caught in the invisible strings she pulled with her bow. Even the clatter inside the restaurant seemed to hush. Diners near the window leaned closer, their meals momentarily forgotten, as the sound of Lily's violin carried through the glass. The city itself seemed to bend around her music, the noise of horns and hurried footsteps dimming, leaving only her voice through the strings. By the time she drew the last, lingering note into the night air, the crowd was utterly silent. For a long, suspended moment, no one moved, no one spoke. It was as if the world had paused, caught in the fragile thread of something too pure to interrupt. Lily's chest rose and fell, her arms trembling from both exhaustion and fear. She opened her eyes slowly, bracing herself for more laughter. Instead, she found tears. Tears on the faces of strangers who had moments before ridiculed her. Tears streaming down cheeks hidden behind expensive scarves, pooling in the eyes of men who had thought themselves too hardened to cry. The cruel laughter had vanished, replaced by something Lily hadn't seen in a very long time, humanity. And though she still stood outside in the cold, violin clutched tightly in her fragile hands, Lily no longer felt invisible. For the first time in months, she wasn't just a homeless girl. She was a musician. She was a soul who had reminded others of their own. The final note lingered in the air like a breath held too long, and when it faded, the silence that followed was thick with something unspoken. Lily's bow slipped from the strings, her arms trembling as though the music had drained the last of her strength. She stared down at the cracked pavement, bracing herself for rejection once more. She had poured everything she had into those notes, her hunger, her loneliness, her hope, and for a heartbeat she feared it would all fall flat, leaving her even emptier than before. Then, slowly, a sound broke through the stillness. Not laughter, not mockery, it was the sound of hands clapping, tentative at first, then stronger, rising until it echoed off the walls of the restaurant. A few people wiped their eyes as they applauded, others stepped closer, guilt and admiration written plainly across their faces. Lily blinked in disbelief, unsure if she was dreaming, unsure if this moment was real. A man in a dark blue coat stepped forward, his shoes polished, his eyes glassy. He set down the plate he had just carried out of the restaurant and bent so that he was closer to her height. His voice was thick when he spoke. "No one should play like that on an empty stomach," he said softly, pushing the plate toward her. Steam curled upward, carrying with it the rich scent of roasted chicken, potatoes, and warm bread. Lily's stomach clenched at the sight, her throat tightening as she whispered, "For me." The man only nodded, placing a fork in her trembling hand. She sat on the edge of the sidewalk, lowering the violin gently into its case before taking her first bite. The flavors filled her mouth, almost overwhelming after so many days of emptiness. She chewed slowly, afraid that if she rushed it the food might vanish like a dream. Tears stung her eyes as she swallowed, not just from the food, but from the kindness that had delivered it. But the man wasn't alone. Others from the crowd began to step forward too, moved by something they couldn't quite name. A woman slipped off her thick scarf and draped it around Lily's shoulders, tucking it gently as if she were caring for her own child. "It's too cold out here without this," she murmured, her lips quivering. Another man reached into his wallet, pressing a few bills into the violin case. "You shouldn't have to beg," he said, his voice low, almost ashamed. Soon, coins and bills began to pile inside, the case filling with far more than Lily had ever hoped for. One young couple bent down beside her, the woman holding out a cup of hot cocoa, its steam rising like a promise of warmth. "You're incredible," she whispered, her eyes shining. "Don't ever stop playing." The man beside her added, "We'll come hear you again." "I mean it." Lily's lips trembled into the faintest smile, her heart fluttering with something she hadn't felt in so long, belonging. Inside the restaurant, the manager, who had been watching from the window, stepped outside. His apron still clung to his waist, and his eyes were wide, as if he too had been caught off guard by the power of her music. He cleared his throat, then spoke with a voice that carried over the gathering. "If you ever want to play inside, for our guests," he said, "we'd be honored to have you." The words struck Lily harder than she expected. She, the girl who had just been mocked, was being invited in, offered a place not on the sidewalk but within the warm glow she had only dared to watch from afar. She covered her mouth with her hands, the fork nearly slipping from her fingers. "I don't know what to say," she whispered. "You already said it," the first man replied, pointing gently at the violin. "You said it better than any words could." The group around her grew, strangers leaning in not out of pity but out of admiration, offering food, warmth, encouragement. In their eyes, she wasn't just a homeless girl anymore. She was an artist, a reminder of something pure they had forgotten in the rush of their comfortable lives. The very people who had laughed at her only minutes ago were now the ones with tears in their eyes, desperate to make right what their cruelty had broken. For Lily, the moment was overwhelming. She had carried her violin through nights when her stomach ached, through streets where people looked away as if she didn't exist. She had played in alleys to no one, whispering her sorrow into the strings because it was the only way she knew how to keep going. And now, Here she was, surrounded by people who listened, who heard, who felt. It was as though the music had cracked open a door not just in their hearts, but in her own. The night air no longer felt so bitter. The scarf around her neck held warmth, but it was the warmth of something deeper that spread through her, the warmth of being seen, of being valued. She glanced at her violin case, now filled with money and kindness, and her lips parted in disbelief. For the first time in so long, she felt a spark of possibility. When she looked up, the crowd was still watching, waiting. She drew a shaky breath and said softly, "Thank you, I only wanted to share my music." Her words trembled, but they carried a power greater than she knew. That night, when the crowd finally drifted away, each person carried something heavier than the weight of a good meal. They carried a reminder. A reminder that kindness costs nothing, but it changes everything. Some went home to families and held them tighter. Some sat quietly with their thoughts, realizing how quickly they had judged. And some resolved never to walk past someone hungry or hurting without stopping again. As for Lily, she curled up later in a shelter, her violin beside her and her stomach full. For the first time in months, she fell asleep not with the ache of hunger, but with the echo of applause still ringing softly in her ears. And in that quiet moment, she believed, truly believed, that tomorrow might be different.